warfare would of course be a war crime. Most recently, Israel's defense minister talked openly about moving Palestinians into what he called a humanitarian city. We understand that the proposal is to forcibly displace Palestinians to a designated zone near Rafah. Now, I don't know how to describe this, but it is not humanitarian. Mr. President, states and armed groups must uphold the rules, forged because of the horrors of conflict and hatred that protect civilians in war. Today, across the world, we watch these rules being corroded and degraded. Again, it is, of course, for you to decide how you act to ensure that all parties respect international humanitarian law. But I agree with some members of the Israeli cabinet that you have consistently overestimated your powers of quiet persuasion. We hold all parties to the standards of international law in this conflict. We don't have to choose, and in fact, we must not choose, between demanding the end to the starvation of civilians in Gaza and demanding the unconditional release of all the hostages. And we must reject anti-Semitism. We must fight it with every fiber of our DNA. But we must also hold Israel to the same principles and laws of all other states. So civilians must be protected wherever they are. Hostages must be released, I say it again. Humanitarian aid must be allowed to enter at scale, and humanitarian workers must be protected. You owe that to Israeli and Palestinian civilians, to the last hopes of a sustainable peace, and to the UN Charter. All members of this council have been unequivocal. Ceasefire, ceasefire, ceasefire. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Fletcher for his briefing. I now give the floor to Executive Director Catherine Russell.
Excellencies, good afternoon. Thank you very much to Pakistan as the President of the Council and to member states for bringing us together this afternoon. Thank you for inviting UNICEF to share our firsthand perspective on this desperate situation of Gaza's 1 million children. From the beginning of the present conflict, children, Palestinian and Israeli, have suffered terribly. Children have been killed, traumatized, and taken hostage. Children have been orphaned and injured. Children are hungry and lack clean water. Children are out of school, and the safety of their homes is a distant memory. Children are not political actors. They do not start conflicts, and they are powerless to stop them. But they suffer greatly, and they wonder why the world has failed them. And make no mistake, we have failed them. Over the past 21 months of war, more than 17,000 children have reportedly been killed and 33,000 injured in Gaza. An average of 28 children have been killed each day, the equivalent of an entire classroom. Consider that for a moment, a whole classroom of children killed every day for nearly 2 years. These children are not combatants. They are being killed and maimed as they line up for life-saving food and medicine. Last week, 15 Palestinians, including 9 children and 4 women, were killed by a strike while waiting in line for UNICEF nutritional supplies in Deir al-Balah. Among the survivors was Donia, a mother seeking a lifeline for her family after months of desperation and hunger. Donia's 1-year-old son, Mohammed, was killed in an attack after speaking his first words just hours earlier. When we spoke with Donia, she was lying critically injured in a hospital bed, clutching Mohammed's tiny shoe. This past weekend, 10 people, including 7 children, were killed in an attack while collecting drinking water. And just today, at least 20 people, some of whom were children, were reportedly killed in a chaotic surge of people at a Gaza Humanitarian Foundation distribution site in southern Gaza. Between May 27th and July 7th, the UN Human Rights Office recorded the killings of 798 Palestinian civilians, including children, desperate to find food at or near distribution sites and humanitarian convoys. At the same time, the situation, as Mr. Fletcher mentioned, in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, has significantly deteriorated. Since the start of the year, 33 Palestinian children have been killed in militarized operations and settler attacks. More than 32,000 people have been forcibly displaced, while the demolition of homes and roads and the use of explosive weapons in populated areas continue. In addition, the number of Palestinian children from the West Bank in detention for alleged security-related offenses has reached its highest level in 7 years. This includes 120 children detained without charge or trial under administrative detention orders. Excellencies, children who survive the war in Gaza will be forever affected by the deprivation and exposure to traumatic events they've experienced. Even before the war began, half of Gaza's child population needed mental health and psychological support. Today, all of Gaza's children need these services. Children in Gaza are enduring catastrophic living conditions, including severe food insecurity and malnutrition. Of the more than 113,000 children screened for malnutrition in June, nearly 6,000 were found to be acutely malnourished. This represents a staggering 180% increase in acute malnutrition cases compared to February. These severely malnourished children need consistent supervised treatment along with safe water and medical care to survive. In addition, water production capacity has plummeted, and as a result, 95% of households in Gaza do not have access to adequate water. Water pumping, desalination, and wastewater treatment are all operating at significantly reduced capacity because of the lack of fuel, and sanitation services are nearing collapse. With clean water increasingly difficult to access, children have little choice but to drink contaminated water. This is increasing the risk of disease outbreaks, with waterborne diseases now making up 44% of all healthcare consultations. We continue to see more cases of diarrheal and respiratory infection in children under the age of 5. And in recent days, our UNICEF team in Gaza have been responding to a meningitis outbreak with dozens of infants now gravely ill. Thousands of children need urgent medical support. Children with traumatic injuries and severe pre-existing medical conditions are at risk of death because the medical care they need is unavailable in the Gaza Strip. Hospitals that are still able to operate are overwhelmed, with emergency departments operating at full capacity and occupancy exceeding 100%. These facilities are facing severe shortages of essential medicine and fuel, disrupting critical care and leaving some operating rooms in the dark. Access to critical newborn care has been reduced by nearly 70%. At least 12,500 patients with severe injuries, chronic diseases, and complex medical conditions need urgent medical evacuation, including thousands of children. But only a small number of countries are taking in patients from Gaza, resulting in even more preventable deaths. Here, I would like to commend those countries, including those in the region, who are accepting patients from Gaza. Until Gaza's healthcare system has sufficient capacity, UNICEF is calling for increased support for medical evacuations, with the guarantee that all evacuated patients and their caregivers can return to Gaza following treatment and recovery. Excellencies, in mid-May, after almost 11 weeks of a complete aid blockade, authorities permitted a trickle of UN supplies to enter the Strip. It is nowhere near enough. Between May 19th and July 2nd, authorities allowed an average of 30 UN trucks per day to offload aid at designated crossings. This included UNICEF nutrition products, water treatment supplies, and vaccines. But 30 trucks a day are a fraction of what is needed for 2 million people to survive. We continue to call on the authorities to permit the entry and delivery of humanitarian aid in Gaza at sufficient speed and scale to meet the urgent needs of children and families. This includes fuel. With electricity cut off since the start of the war, all operations inside the Gaza Strip, hospital generators, ambulances, bakeries, water and sanitation facilities, and the communications network depend on fuel. A crippling fuel shortage is now forcing essential services to shut down, putting the lives of over 1 million children at risk. Fuel must be consistently allowed into Gaza in sufficient quantities to sustain life-saving operations. Excellencies, for the last several months, the UN-led humanitarian response has been sidelined, despite the fact that during the March ceasefire, we were delivering assistance in an efficient and safe manner. This included essential vaccines and neonatal care, life-saving nutrition services, and access to clean water, provided through more than 400 distribution points across Gaza. UNICEF and our partners went even further, delivering aid door to door, reaching malnourished children and pregnant mothers directly in their places of refuge. We implore you again to ensure that UNICEF and our humanitarian partners are allowed to do our jobs. We have proven that essentials like medicine, vaccines, water, food, and nutrition for babies can reach those in need wherever they are when we have appropriate access. We urgently need a return to the functioning UN-led aid pipeline with safe and sustained humanitarian access through all available crossings. In addition, UNICEF reiterates the Secretary General's appeal to ensure that all aid delivery is demilitarized and grounded in the principles of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. Civilian safety must be paramount. I urge this Council to use its full weight to press parties to accept these principles and rules. Excellencies, in Gaza, the effects of the violence perpetrated on children have been catastrophic. International law is clear. All parties to the conflict have an obligation to protect civilians and ensure the safe and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian assistance. We call on all parties to immediately act to protect children. We call on Israel to urgently review its rules of engagement to ensure full compliance with international humanitarian law, notably the protection of civilians, including children, and to conduct thorough and independent investigations of incidents and alleged violations to ensure accountability. And we call on all parties to abide by their legal obligations to ensure the survival and well-being of the civilian population, including through safe, rapid, and unimpeded humanitarian access. We call on Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups to uphold international humanitarian law, including respect for facilities that civilians depend on and the facilitation of unimpeded access. In addition, they should immediately and unconditionally release all hostages held inside Gaza. All parties to the conflict should urgently agree to a ceasefire, and we call on this Council to use all tools at its disposal to address human suffering and put an end to this war. Lastly, we call on all member states to use their leverage to de-escalate the conflict in the meantime. Excellencies, the simple truth is that we are failing Gaza's children. Seen through their eyes, our failure is a betrayal of their right to be children, children who are healthy, who are safe, and who are educated. History will judge this failure harshly, and the children will judge it too. Children in Gaza, like children all over the world, deserve peace. Our job is to give children the future they deserve. We simply must do better. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Russell for her briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. And I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I'd like to start by thanking USG ERC Fletcher and Executive Director Russell for their sobering briefings and to thank them for the courage and the work of their teams on the ground. The United Kingdom, together with Denmark, France, Greece and Slovenia, called for this meeting out of deep concern for the Israeli government's inhumane approach to the crisis in Gaza. This week marks 650 days since the horrific Hamas attacks of October 7th. With each day that passes, the hostages suffer yet more agony, in appalling conditions and deprived from contact with their loved ones. And with each day that passes, the people of Gaza suffer death, desperation and displacement. This conflict has gone on for far too long. There is a deal to be done. We urge the parties to engage in the spirit of compromise to secure an immediate ceasefire, the release of the hostages, and a pathway towards lasting peace. I'll make 3 points. First, it is imperative that Israel lift its restrictions on aid entering Gaza. Without fuel, water systems and hospitals in Gaza are on the verge of collapse. Without medical supplies, treatable illnesses are costing lives. And without food, Palestinians are dying from malnutrition or forced desperately to scramble for supplies. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has acknowledged that the UN has the unique capacity to meet the immense humanitarian need. So we call on Israel to allow the UN to save lives immediately and without obstruction. The United Kingdom welcomes the agreement between the EU and Israel, but we need to see words turned into action. Second, we strongly oppose the expansion of Israel's military operations. We urge Israel immediately to implement and enforce robust measures to protect civilians. In the past 4 months, more than 1,000 children have been killed. Palestinians have also been fired upon by the IDF while desperately seeking food, with 800 people killed at aid sites. This is abhorrent. Third, the United Kingdom is appalled by the Israeli Defense Minister's comments on forced displacement of Palestinians to Rafah. This would contravene the fundamental principles upon which the UN was founded. Palestinian territory must not be reduced, and civilians must be able to return home. President, the path forward lies in diplomacy and compromise to deliver lasting peace for Israelis and Palestinians alike. We commend the leadership of France and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in co-chairing the upcoming conference on a two-state solution, which offers us a crucial opportunity to advance this goal. I thank you.
Representative of the United Kingdom for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me also thank USG Fletcher and UNICEF Executive Director Russell for your detailed and sobering briefings. And through you, our thanks go to your teams on the ground working under such difficult circumstances. Mr. President, the situation in Gaza is nothing short of catastrophic. The level of human suffering, clearly outlined by our briefers today and many times before, is appalling. That is why Denmark, together with France, Greece, Slovenia, and the UK, called for this urgent meeting. Allow me to focus on 3 key concerns. First, active hostilities continue to claim countless Palestinian lives. Strikes on people sheltering in schools and tents, and on those seeking food, water, and other assistance continue to be reported, resulting in mass casualties. We call on all parties to protect civilians, humanitarian personnel, and civilian infrastructure in accordance with international humanitarian law. Since the establishment of the first GHF food distribution site on 27 May, more than 800 Palestinians have been killed and over 5,000 injured when trying to access food, their life cut short while simply trying to survive. We deplore the killing of starving civilians trying to get food and reiterate our call for transparent investigations into those incidents. The alarming frequency and scale of these incidents are wholly unacceptable. Second, Mr. President, as part of Israel's expanded military campaign, Israeli forces have continued to issue additional displacement orders. Combined, these orders place more than 85% of Gaza's territory under displacement orders. Civilians have no safe place to go and are instead confined to ever-shrinking spaces. Denmark rejects any forced displacement and calls for the full respect for the ICJ's advisory opinion. Any unilateral attempts to alter the demographic or territorial status of the Gaza Strip are unacceptable and constitute a clear violation of international law. Further, we stress that civilians must be able to return safely to the communities. Third, Mr. President, while some food assistance, fuel, and medicines have been able to enter the Gaza Strip recently, as we've heard, the amount remained nothing more than a drop in a vast ocean of desperate need. Nearly 1 in 3 people are going entire days without eating, while hospitals face imminent shutdown as fuel stocks run out. Under these conditions, children remain among the most vulnerable, with the number of malnourished children rising at an alarming rate, as we just heard from Executive Director Russell. Meanwhile, we have witnessed the sidelining of the United Nations and established international humanitarian organizations from operating in Gaza. Truckloads of much-needed aid deliveries are waiting just outside the border in order to deliver much-needed aid to the Palestinian people. From the European Union side, we'll follow closely the implementation of the recent common understanding with Israel on humanitarian access to Gaza with the aim of improving the situation on the ground. Denmark's position is clear. All restrictions on humanitarian aid must be lifted. We reiterate Israel's clear obligation under international law to ensure full, safe, and unimpeded access to humanitarian aid while observing the humanitarian principle of independence, impartiality, neutrality, and humanity to all Palestinians in need, half of whom are children. Humanitarian aid must never be politicized, used as a political bargaining chip or as part of a military strategy. As we've stated before, this sets a dangerous precedent for the future of humanitarian work in war zones around the world. This is why we support the UN's coordinated plan to resume humanitarian aid deliveries to Gaza. The UN, including UNRWA, alongside the humanitarian partners, must be allowed to do their job, to safely provide the necessary supplies, as well as the uninterrupted delivery of services across Gaza. As USG Fletcher said, it doesn't have to be like that. Mr. President, in addition to lifting all the restrictions on humanitarian aid, we urgently need an immediate ceasefire and for Hamas to immediately and unconditionally release the remaining hostages held since the brutal terror attack on October 7, 2023. Meanwhile, the two-state solution remains the only viable path to achieve sustainable peace and stability in the Middle East. We welcome the recent announcement by France and Saudi Arabia that the high-level conference will be resumed on 28 July. We look forward to this opportunity for member states to advance concrete measures for the implementation of a two-state solution. I thank you.
Of Denmark for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, with our British, Danish, Greek and Slovenia partners, we called for this council meeting because there is an urgent need, therefore. I wish to thank the Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Mr. Tom Fletcher. I also thank Executive Director of UNICEF, Ms. Catherine Russell, for their briefings. Their briefings mean that comments are not enough. They're brutal in the detail they describe, and they push the Council to move from words to action. First of all, Israel must be reminded that it must respect international law and that it is bound by its obligations towards the Palestinian population, particularly the people in Gaza. Israel must put an end to its blockade on humanitarian aid. The distribution system managed by the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is unacceptable. It is incompatible with the obligations under international law and the humanitarian principles of impartiality, neutrality and independence. Since the opening of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation distribution centres, hundreds of people have lost their lives during food distributions and thousands have been wounded. This is unconscionable. Humanitarian aid, what's more, must never be instrumentalized to serve political ends. It must enter Gaza immediately and at scale. It must do so safely and unimpeded, and it must reach every civilian in need. This in accordance yet again with international humanitarian law. Secondly, the Council must call upon Israel to fully implement its commitments, namely those pursuant to the agreement signed with the European Union on July 10th. That agreement should make it possible to increase the unimpeded delivery of aid. This assistance, as provided for by the agreement, must be provided by the United Nations and its partners. They are the only stakeholders with the capacity to deliver aid while stringently adhering to humanitarian principles and with all possible guarantees regarding the proper distribution of the aid. Of course, food aid, but beyond food aid, medical aid and all other types of aids. all aid to guarantee the survival of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians who have the right to that assistance and to protection. The Council must reiterate its support to the United Nations and its humanitarian work. However, for as long as Gaza remains an active war zone, this aid will fall short of need. This Council must continue to call for an immediate, comprehensive and lasting ceasefire, as well as for the release of all hostages that remain detained by Hamas. They must be unconditionally released. These are the only ways to guarantee the real protection of people and sustained humanitarian access. Proposals for agreements have been presented. Talks must now forge ahead on this basis in good faith, and once again we commend the tireless mediation efforts made by Qatar, the United States, Egypt, and we support these efforts. Finally, the extremely grave nature of the humanitarian situation in Gaza reminds us every day that it is urgent to strive for a political settlement to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is the only solution able to meet the legitimate aspirations of the Israeli and Palestinian people for peace and security. It is in this spirit that France and Saudi Arabia will, on the 29th and 30th in New York, co-chair the International Conference on the Implementation of the Two-State Solution held under the aegis of the GA. This is not a utopia, it's not a pipe dream, that two-state solution. It is a pathway towards a future. The 8 working groups will work under the UN umbrella, and they will identify tangible ways forward to bring the two-state solution to fruition, to once again restore a political horizon for the benefit of Israelis and Palestinians. I thank you.
Representative of France for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for responding to the joint call of 5 member states, namely United Kingdom, Denmark, France, Slovenia, and my own country, Greece, for an urgent briefing of the humanitarian situation in Gaza. I would also like to thank our briefers, Under-Secretary General Tom Fletcher and Executive Director of UNICEF, Mrs. Catherine Russell, for their briefings. Mr. President, a year and a half into this conflict, a severe humanitarian crisis has taken hold of the entire Gaza Strip. The entire population of Gaza, half of whom are children, is facing conditions of unimaginable distress, displaced, unsafe, deprived of access to basic means of survival. They struggle every day to make it to the next. We continue to urge Israel to allow and facilitate the safe, unconditional, massive and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid at scale, and to restore full access to electricity and water. The population in need must be given safe access to humanitarian aid and care, while the safety and security of humanitarian workers must be respected. Humanitarian aid must never be politicized or used as a means of pressure. We repeat our position that any humanitarian plan must adhere to the core principles of international humanitarian law, cover all parts of Gaza, and support the existing humanitarian operation within the Strip. It is clear that Israeli GHF plan falls short of that and has led to increased fatalities. There is, however, a glimmer of hope. We welcome the agreement reached between Israel and the European Union on scaling up humanitarian aid to the people in Gaza. We expect that the agreed steps are implemented urgently so as to substantially increase the daily trucks of food and non-food items and result in opening of more crossings in the southern and northern part of Gaza. It is beyond doubt that this goal cannot be achieved without the valuable expertise of the UN, and UNRWA's role remains pivotal and indispensable. At the same time, the development highlights the need for constructive engagement with Israel. Furthermore, as High Representative of the European Union, Ms. Kallas, has stated, all measures should be taken to ensure that the increased humanitarian aid benefits directly the Gazan population and it is not diverted by Hamas. Mr. President, while efforts led by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States to secure a deal for a much-needed ceasefire are ongoing, we do not forget that hostages continue to suffer, being held in captivity by Hamas for 19 months already. Having repeatedly condemned the October 7 terrorist attacks and the ongoing detention and inhumane treatment of hostages, we reiterate our demand for the immediate and unconditional release, and we deplore the refusal of Hamas to hand them over. Hamas remains an obstacle to peace. Mr. President, While conditions in Gaza remains dire, the situation is alarming in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. We condemn the escalation of violence there, following the continued settler violence, the expansion of illegal settlements, and Israel's military operation. The repeated attacks against Taibeh, one of the Christian majority villages in the West Bank, are very disturbing. Settlement expansion is contrary to international law and the relevant Security Council resolution, and seriously undermines prospects for a two-state solution. We look forward to the upcoming conference under the co-chairmanship of France and Saudi Arabia to be resumed later this month, so as to bring new impetus to the political process, given that the Palestinian issue remains central for regional as well as world security stability. In this spirit, Greece stands ready to engage towards moving the Arab plan forward, as presented by Egypt, and further develop it where necessary. It is a constructive proposal for planning the day after in Gaza, where an empowered and reformed Palestinian Authority will be capable of exerting effective governments in Gaza and the West Bank, without any government or security role for Hamas and without any forced displacement for the Palestinians. Mr. President, in closing, let me stress that there is no military solution for Gaza. All sides must now harness the necessary political courage to agree to a ceasefire and end the war and pave the way for a political process towards two states living side by side in peace and security. I thank you.
Thanking the representative of Greece for the statement, I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I want to thank Undersecretary General Fletcher and Director General Russell for sharing information on the situation on the ground. And we bow our heads to the humanitarian workers who are risking and ultimately sacrificing their lives for civilians in Gaza. Mr. President, looking back 80 years, one can observe the way conflicts have evolved. Yet one feature remains the same: denial of the parties of the reality on the ground and the atrocities that they are committing. However, the day of admission eventually comes, many times too late. 30 years ago, very close to my home country, we heard statements that there were practically no civilian victims, how the people were well nourished, how one side acted in self-defense. We saw a UN entity treated as an enemy. We also saw people being pushed into so-called safe zones and then targeted indiscriminately. The day came, too late for too many. Colleagues, the day will eventually come in Gaza. Is it going to be too late again? Mr. President, Slovenia keeps calling for and demanding an immediate and unconditional ceasefire and release of all hostages. However, the absence of a ceasefire does not absolve any party of its obligation to respect international humanitarian law and to ensure the unimpeded delivery of humanitarian assistance and other basic items, including adequate fuel at scale. It is clear from today's briefings that we are not seeing the actions that are urgently needed. Quite the opposite. The situation is becoming worse by the day. And with this in mind, we want to underline three main messages. One, the UN, including UNRWA, and its humanitarian partners must remain the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza. During the last ceasefire, they proved that they can deliver if only they are allowed. In their work, they must be ensured full protection and unlimited access. Two, while we welcome the efforts of different players to conduct negotiations, we emphasize once again Israel's obligations under international law are clear. International law, including international humanitarian law, must be respected. This is non-negotiable. Three, humanitarian action, including aid delivery, must be based on the established principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. These principles ensure the effective and ethical delivery of aid in any conflict zone. They prevent humanitarian aid from being used as an instrument of war. Tragic incidents in Gaza near GHF sites remind us that there are no blurred lines with regard to the respect of international humanitarian law. Either you respect it or you don't. While the humanitarian situation is only getting worse, the military offensive continues relentlessly. The suffering of civilians in Gaza and hostages still in captivity persists. Statements and plans on further forced displacement are still looming. Instead of playing and learning, the daily life of children in Gaza is marked by displacement, malnourishment, and perpetual trauma. What we need urgently is a ceasefire in Gaza. We need political will to end this war and political will to build peace. Instead, we are witnessing sanctions on the representatives of international bodies and mechanisms solely for carrying out the work the UN has mandated them to do. We take this opportunity to thank those working to ensure accountability for violations taking place on both sides of the conflict. Mr. President, we are appalled by the civilian killings in Gaza, killings for which we never receive any indication of the state of investigations, let alone their results. Today, civilians are being killed while waiting for water. Starving children are being killed while waiting for food. Humanitarian workers are being killed while saving people in Gaza. As we continue to witness all of this, I'm afraid what might no longer be possible to salvage, colleagues, is our collective dignity, and the day will come. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr.
President, I would like to thank the Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Tom Fletcher, and the Executive Director of UNICEF, Catherine Russell. We thank them for their briefings, which showed us the true scale of the tragedy of Palestinian civilians continuing in Gaza. Day in, day out, we are seeing the humanitarian situation there, which is plumbing new and new depths. The people in the Strip are living under the conditions of full-scale humanitarian disaster, and they are facing unfathomable hardship and hunger, which kills the adults and children. At the same time, despite the efforts by the humanitarian agencies and basically unanimous support from the Security Council, the humanitarian assistance, which is something that essentially all people in the Strip depend, is arriving in highly restricted amounts, and which are clearly not commensurate with the scale of the disaster. The situation is worsening quickly while there's a critical shortage of fuel, which is needed for the functioning of the basic infrastructure. Without fuel, what could happen is a complete paralysis of the hospitals, water supply systems, and food distribution centers, and that threatens the lives of hundreds of thousands of civilians. We are particularly worried by the news that there is a possible stoppage of the water desalination facilities. It's unacceptable to have the people in Gaza, children first and foremost, that they are left without access to drinking water. The collapse of the water supply system can also lead to the outbreak of infectious diseases, which would further compound the humanitarian situation. Mr. President, the continued ground operations by the IDF and the artillery shelling throughout the territory of the Gaza Strip create truly impossible conditions, impossible for the survival of civilians. We firmly condemn these attacks, as a result of which civilians are killed and wounded. We are particularly worried by the consistent and clear pattern of strikes against those areas where people congregate looking for food, including near food distribution centers. According to the data from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, no fewer than 798 Palestinians died in the enclave as they were trying to obtain humanitarian assistance, and this is since the end of May this year. We're particularly concerned by a huge number of victims near those centers which are under the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, and this is a mechanism, as many of us had warned in this chamber, instead of solving humanitarian tasks, has become a symbol of humiliation of human dignity and is life-threatening for those who need such assistance. Hundreds of people who died when they were trying to obtain assistance is a grim testimony of this fact. The work of this mechanism is dangerous for the beneficiaries and is morally unacceptable. We are convinced the UN Secretariat took the only right and responsible decision when they decided not to participate in this punishment, essentially, scheme under the guise of humanitarian operation. Let me recall here that very recently more than 200 NGOs launched a joint appeal to stop the work of this violent militarized mechanism, where Palestinians are faced with an impossible choice to decide whether they will die of hunger or while they're queuing up for their food ration. Unfortunately, despite all of this, Israel and the United States continue considering this mechanism effective, and they're bragging about the millions of numbers of meals that are supposedly have been passed on to the civilians and not Hamas. These statements are dubious at least and are not supported by the real situation in the Strip. One thing is clear here. If Israel assisted and not obstructed the humanitarian assistance supplies through the UN, then we would have at least a faint glimmer of hope that the humanitarian crisis would ease. Well, today we do not have such hope, and the massive collective punishment against Palestinians in violation of the basic rules of the IHL is something that's going on in front of our eyes. Mr. President, we are shaken by the recent strikes against the people in Deir el-Balah who were trying to obtain humanitarian assistance from UNICEF. As a result of this attack, tens of people were wounded and killed, and this includes 9 Palestinian children. On the 13th of July, in the Nusayrat camp, according to UN data, 7 more children were killed as they were queuing up for water near a humanitarian distribution center. These tragedies have become a frightful everyday occurrence, and we firmly condemn the killing of innocent civilians who were only trying to obtain the assistance that they vitally need. Such attacks undermine the very possibility of saving human lives and are a gross violation of international humanitarian law. Unfortunately, humanitarian personnel are also continue dying. There was another strike against the office of a humanitarian organization delivered on the 10th of July in Gaza, took the lives of 3 more humanitarians. This tragic incident once again shows how high the risk is that humanitarians are facing when they are doing their duty under the conditions of constant present danger. In parallel to attacks against humanitarians and the reporters who are covering Gaza, there is a true persecution unfolding against UN bodies which are out of favor, and this refers to UNRWA first and foremost, and this is the agency which for decades have been helping Palestinians with humanitarian assistance, education, and health care. UNRWA's uninterrupted and stable work is a guarantee of survival for the millions of Palestinians who are living not just in Gaza, but, as we all know, also in neighboring countries, the countries which took in refugees. We'd like to underscore here that there has never been an alternative to UNRWA. And after UNRWA and the UN Secretary General, they went after the special procedures under the Human Rights Council. Such acts are not in line with the duties of a UN member states. They are in violation of the Charter and in violation of the Convention on Immunities and Privileges. This situation requires a very decisive international reaction. The protection and providing for the civilians in the occupied Palestinian territories is a duty of Israel as an occupying power. And this is not something that depends on whether or not it's acceptable for the Israeli leadership. We insist on unconditionally ensuring the safety of civilians. Unfortunately, all attempts by the international community to obtain the very basic principles of humanity being abided by are encountering an all-around support by Washington to its ally. Washington essentially gave to West Jerusalem a carte blanche on any activity against Palestinians. Mr. President, if anyone is thinking that the situation in Gaza could not possibly get worse, well, they're probably wrong. According to the information we are getting, including from Israeli officials, West Jerusalem is preparing a new plan to move 600,000 Palestinians in the so-called humanitarian city in Rafah, south of the Morag military corridor. And the goal here to, in future, concentrate all 2 million Palestinians there, having checked them against their links with Hamas. The Commissioner General of UNRWA, Philip Lazzarini, has already characterized this plan as, in essence, trying to create a huge concentration camp, the Palestinian inhabitants of which will be deprived of any prospects for their future. We would like to point out here that the former Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Olmert, also shares such an assessment, and he called this initiative a part of a general campaign conducted by the Netanyahu government to conduct an ethnic cleansing and deportation of Palestinians. It would be interesting to hear an assessment of this initiative from OCHA and UNICEF. Mr. President, unfortunately, Gaza is not the only area where the Palestinians are situations so dire. We're very worried by the situation in the West Bank. There we're seeing intensified operations by the Israeli forces, especially in the north. What is being done by West Jerusalem leads to massive destruction, worsens humanitarian crisis, and deprives the displaced families of any hope for a return. We regularly receive information about the killings and violence against the Palestinians, the seizure of territory, and the demolition of their buildings. And this is unacceptable. We call on Israel to immediately stop the violence in the occupied Palestinian territory, to ensure that the people are protected and the humanitarian assistance to civilians is not impeded. They need this now more than ever. It's important also to stop the expansion of settlements, stop the provocations on behalf of the settlers who are publicly humiliating the honor and dignity of the Palestinians. Mr. President, we all in this chamber have said many times that ensuring unimpeded humanitarian access to all of the needy in the Strip under the conditions of a continued military operation by the ADF is essentially mission impossible. Furthermore, it's clear for everyone that using force so as to save the hostages in Gaza is something that has shown to be ineffective. And in this regard, we would like to call on the parties yet once again to reach agreements on ceasefire with the help of the mediation, such agreements which would result in the release and the exchange of all forcibly detained people. In order for the authorities in Israel to finally lift the blockade of this sector, the Washington has to reject their unconditional support for West Jerusalem, stop covering their violations of IHL, and use their influence to stabilize the situation. We're convinced that there is no alternative to this here. This is the only way that the vicious circle of violence can be broken, and the relaunching of the peace process of the Middle East settlement on the two-state solution can be obtained. The ultimate goal here is to create an independent Palestinian state within the 1967 borders with the capital in East Jerusalem, coexisting with Israel in peace and security. The many years of the Israeli-Arab conflict has shown that there is no other alternative peaceful scenario in the Middle East. In this context, we welcome the intent on the part of Saudi Arabia and France to convene an international high-level conference to support the two-state solution at the end of the month in New York, and we plan to participate in it very actively. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG Tom Fletcher and Executive Director Catherine Russell of UNICEF for their sobering briefings. Mr. President, humanitarian assistance should not be used as a political tool. And aid seekers must not risk their lives to get life-saving assistance. Unfortunately, what we witness every day in Gaza for several months contradicts our fundamental belief. We are deeply concerned by the recent announcement by the UN that as of July 13th, 875 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed while trying to reach food. Out of those victims, 674 were killed in the vicinity of the GHF sites. Every effort to deliver humanitarian aid, including food, medicine, and fuel, should be encouraged. But what we should not overlook is that such assistance must be carried out in a safe and dignified way, in full compliance with humanitarian principles. Amid the complete restrictions of access to the international media, we still encounter shocking videos and overwhelming testimonies about each person's experience at the GHF distribution sites. Those witnesses are not only Palestinian civilians, but also now include foreign security employees and even IDF soldiers. Despite this situation, there is still a persistent lack of accurate and sufficient information. Despite this situation, there is still a persistent lack of accurate and sufficient information on the facts around the GHF aid distribution sites or near UN convoys, and this should not be ignored. As the OHCHR indicated, I quote, "It is not helpful to issue blanket dismissals of the concerns raised by the international community," unquote. A full and transparent investigation should follow. And more importantly, international journalists must be allowed to enter Gaza, witness what is happening, and report the details back to the world. Mr. President, the United Nations has repeatedly stressed that it is ready to work to relieve the extreme suffering of Palestinians in Gaza through the swift and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid to those in need. We trust the desperate but confident voice by the UN. We are aware that the WFP is continuing its delivery of basic food items to local communities, and that the WHO facilitated entry of limited medical supplies into Gaza. However, ongoing restrictions of the requisite aid make it impossible for the UN to meet the needs of 2 million people in Gaza as hunger and violence surge. We thus call on Israel to fully cooperate with the UN to expand the unimpeded entry and delivery of humanitarian aid in Gaza at scale through the UN's well-established and trusted delivery mechanism. We are seriously alarmed by the incessant reports by the UN that everything, notably food, fuel, and medical goods, are in desperate need as existing stocks run out. We call on Israel to help the UN. We repeat our call for the protection of civilians based on the clear principles of international humanitarian law, including distinction, precaution, and proportionality. The daily repetitious killing of innocent aid seekers, such as those killed last weekend queuing for water, including 7 children, must stop immediately, regardless of cause. Mr. President, last week we were hopeful for the finalization of a deal to secure an immediate ceasefire and release of hostages in Gaza. We sincerely hope that through efforts by mediators, US, Qatar, and Egypt, a ceasefire can be resumed in Gaza as soon as possible. As we are concerned by the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza, we are also worried by the fate of the innocent Israeli hostages and the agony of their families. We thus hope that all remaining hostages brutally held by Hamas, both the living and dead, can be unconditionally released, and that an immediate ceasefire can be made permanent. We also hope that any deal to reach ceasefire can be a starting point for a durable peace in Israel and Palestine. Thus, we reiterate our firm oppositions to any proposal to forcibly relocate Palestinian civilians inside or outside of Gaza. Realization of mutual acceptance and respect is the key for lasting peace in the region. I thank you, Mr. President.
The representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, President. At the outset, I thank the UK, Denmark, France, Greece, and Slovenia for the initiative in calling today's meeting. I also thank USG Fletcher and Executive Director Russell for their briefings, which are heart-wrenching. 21 months into the Gaza conflict, the humanitarian situation on the ground has worsened to an unprecedented level. The international community must take strong actions with utmost urgency to alleviate the humanitarian catastrophe. I would like to make the following 3 points. First, humanitarian access must be fully restored. Under Israel's extreme blockade, Gaza is experiencing extreme shortages in all types of supplies for survival and faces imminent large-scale famine. 9 humanitarian agencies, including OCHA and WFP, have all warned that the fuel crisis in Gaza is so severe that all humanitarian operations are at risk of being halted. As the occupying power, Israel has the obligation to guarantee humanitarian assistance under international humanitarian law. This is also a clear requirement contained in a number of Council resolutions and ICJ's orders on provisional measures. China firmly opposes the weaponization of humanitarian assistance and urges Israel to immediately lift the blockade and siege of Gaza so as to fully restore humanitarian access. Second, assistance must be rendered by adhering to humanitarian principles. As the UN has pointed out on many occasions, the militarized aid distribution mechanism launched by the US and Israel violates the principles of impartiality, independence, and neutrality. Not only is this mechanism not sufficient to ease the humanitarian situation, but it has repeatedly caused heavy civilian casualties. The use of force by the Israeli army against civilians seeking assistance in Gaza has resulted in more than 600 deaths and over 5,000 injuries. China strongly condemns the attacks against civilians and calls for accountability through serious and thorough investigations. The UN and other humanitarian agencies have built full-fledged systems with rich experience and therefore are capable of delivering humanitarian supplies on a large scale across Gaza. All parties should support the UN in delivering assistance in a manner that upholds humanitarian principles, while Israel is obligated to guarantee the safety and security of assistance and provide facilitation in all respects. Third, forced displacement of people must be stopped in Gaza. Since the start of the current Gaza conflict, Israel has imposed a large number of evacuation orders, covering more than 86% of Gaza territory, resulting in repeated displacement of more than 1.9 million people. Recently, Israel is reportedly discussing the establishment of a so-called humanitarian city in southern Gaza, and we are gravely concerned about that. Both Gaza and the West Bank are the homeland of the Palestinian people, not bargaining chips in political deals. Any attempt to forcibly transfer the Palestinian people is a grave violation of international law and Council resolutions, and must be firmly rejected by the international community. President, an immediate and lasting ceasefire in Gaza is the is the key precondition for saving lives and easing the humanitarian disaster. While we take note of the recent resumption of ceasefire negotiations, Israeli attacks continue, with new innocent lives lost every day. These cruel facts have shown time and again that peace cannot be achieved by force and that prolongation of a war only leads to more deaths and hatred. We urge Israel to immediately cease all military operations in Gaza. Countries with significant influence over the parties should act in an impartial and responsible manner and take strong and effective actions to promote a ceasefire. The implementation of the two-state solution is the only viable way to resolve the question of Palestine. We welcome the high-level conference on the implementation of the two-state solution to be held at the end of this month and hope that it will give strong impetus to the political process of advancing the two-state solution. China will continue to work with the international community towards quelling the flames of war in Gaza, easing the humanitarian disaster, implementing the two-state solution, and ultimately realizing a comprehensive, just, and lasting settlement of the Palestinian question. Thank you.
I thank the representative of China for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Gracias.
Thank you, Mr. President. Panama thanks you for convening this briefing. We also thank the delegations of Denmark, Slovenia, France, Greece, and the United Kingdom for their timely initiative of convening and calling for this briefing. We also extend our gratitude to Mr. Tom Fletcher, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, and Ms. Catherine Russell, Executive Director of UNICEF. We thank them both for their somber reports. We also welcome the delegations of Israel, Turkey, the Observer State of Palestine, and the European Union. Mr. President, we are taking the floor in this chamber with immediate, unfettered access to clean water that cools our throat after and while we issue statements which call for peace, whilst at the same time they see us recount the horrors of war. As I speak here, I cannot help but think of an image which we might be aware of and which we might even describe in our statements. However, it's an image which is difficult to capture in its fully pixelated horror in these decision-making fora. Here, diplomatic debate sits alongside the emotional distance we have from the realities of Gazan civilians. An image which transcends statistics and reports. It is an image of a Palestinian mother under the blistering July heat, walking among the rubble with an empty drum, hoping that at some distribution site she will be able to fill up 2 measly bottles of water for her children. She does so harbouring the silent fear that she will meet the same fate as that of other children who were killed by a bomb while they were doing exactly what she will do. The contrast is a stark but a real one, because in Gaza, water neither refreshes nor hydrates. Its absence sows despair, and its absence is no accident. It is a slow sentence handed down by humans and the suffering they have induced. Panama reiterates its urgent appeal for the restoration of an immediate ceasefire. A ceasefire which will halt human suffering, facilitate the sustained, unfettered, and at-scale entry of vital humanitarian aid to Gaza, and a ceasefire which will ensure the immediate, dignified, and unconditional release of all the hostages which remain under Hamas control. Hamas's acts of cruelty and barbarism are acts which we once again fervently condemn. These measures are urgent, They are vital and they are feasible. Mr. President, more than 58,000 people have died in Gaza and at least 138,000 have been wounded in these 21 months of war. More than 1.9 million have been displaced, many more than once. And 86% of the territory exists permanently under evacuation orders. The very minimum conditions that must be met for a dignified life seem to have vanished. 80% of Gaza's water and sanitation infrastructure is within militarized zones or in areas under evacuation orders. Regrettably, water no longer soothes or saves. It becomes mud. It is a source of illness and a source of death. According to the World Food Programme, 100% of Gaza's population is facing acute food insecurity, and at least 470,000 people are facing famine. Approximately 71,000 children and 17,000 women require urgent treatment for malnutrition, and 1 of every 3 residents goes entire days without eating a mouthful. Paradoxically, while stores are empty, more than 116,000 metric tons of food, enough to feed 1 million people for 4 months, are patiently awaiting the green light to enter the strip. It isn't that there isn't any food available. It's that its entry is denied or hampered. When it does arrive, accessing it has become a dangerous act. On the 10th of July in Deir al-Balah, an airstrike against a feeding centre killed 15 people. These included 9 children and 4 women. They were killed while they were lining up to receive food aid. 19 more children were wounded. Unfortunately, situations such as these have become part and parcel of everyday life in Gaza, and they demand an end to the war. According to the UN Human Rights Office, since May, at least 875 people have died whilst they were trying to receive aid. In the majority of them were doing so in the areas surrounding the distribution centres operated by mechanisms alternative to those provided by the United Nations system. However well-intentioned such efforts might be, they have exposed Gazan civilians to high operational and security risks at the very moment when they come with the hope of finding respite for their hunger. Just this morning, in another tragic episode, at least 20 people died close to a distribution site following a stampede unleashed by an alleged incident. That once again underscores the fragile nature of these alternative mechanisms and the risks they pose to the civilian population. The aforementioned makes it patently clear that in addition to being unsafe, these alternative mechanisms have proven insufficient, ineffective, and in some cases even counterproductive. The future of Gaza's people cannot remain one of death, hunger, thirst, and perpetual displacement. Panama reaffirms its support for the United Nations agencies. They have proven to have the operational capacity necessary even under the most extreme conditions. Consequently, we insist that all humanitarian efforts must strengthen and not replace or substitute the already established mechanisms. We reiterate that the protection of civilians, humanitarian personnel, and United Nations facilities is an obligation under international humanitarian law. Mr. President, In a world which produces enough food for everybody, in a world which has developed technologies capable of saving lives, and in a world which has the means to make humanitarian aid arrive where it's needed, even in the midst of conflict, allowing civilians to die from hunger, thirst, or preventable disease is an unconscionable tragedy. All the more unconscionable is the fact that these victims can be children. That's when it's most unacceptable, because children are the most innocent parties in any war, and they must be protected over and above any political or military differences. Panama will continue to support all efforts to ensure that in a future, hopefully in a near future, through brave decisions and actions, manage to return to the Israeli and the Palestinian people the possibility of living in peace, security, and dignity. Thank you.
Representative of Panama for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Mr. President, Somalia extends its gratitude to Denmark, France, Greece, Slovenia, and the United Kingdom for calling for this urgent meeting. We also thank USG Fletcher, Director Russell, for their sobering insights on the deepening humanitarian crisis in the occupied Palestinian territory, and commend UN personnel's dedication and sacrifices under unprecedented circumstances. We are gravely alarmed by the continuing humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, where families have been shattered, entire neighborhoods obliterated, and nearly 2 million people forcibly displaced. Gaza's health, water, and sanitation systems have collapsed under constant siege and bombardment. According to UNICEF and other agencies, children form the overwhelming percentage of those killed. Today, Gaza stands as the most dangerous place in the world to be a child. The use of starvation as a weapon of war has brought about full-scale famine in most of Gaza. Aid convoys are routinely obstructed or targeted. Over 500 Palestinians have tragically been killed while simply waiting for aid. There is no safe space in Gaza, and the population has exhausted all and its last coping mechanisms. Humanitarian operations are crippled by severe restrictions and ongoing insecurity. Somalia is particularly appalled by the deliberate targeting of humanitarian personnel. More than 340 UN staff members have died since the start of this conflict, the highest number of fatalities among UN personnel in any single conflict. These individuals risked everything to deliver hope and sustenance, which is an indicament of this war's conduct. The killing of aid workers, journalists, and medical staff must be investigated, and those responsible must be held accountable. International humanitarian law must be respected without exceptions. The deliberate targeting of civilians, denial of aid, and the use of starvation as a tool of war are not only morally abhorrent, they are grave violations of international law. These actions are not limited to Gaza. In the occupied West Bank, daily violations by Israeli forces and settlers, including arbitrary killings, home demolitions, and the expansion of illegal settlements, have led to more than 949 Palestinians killed since October 7th, including over 200 children. This is the highest toll since 1967 and only serves to deepen the occupation and undermine the two-state solution. Mr. President, We welcome the ongoing ceasefire proposal and commend the efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States. But words must be matched by action. Our delegation reiterates its call for an immediate, permanent, and unconditional ceasefire, unhindered humanitarian access across Gaza, protection of civilians and aid workers in line with international humanitarian law, and the release of all hostages and detainees on both sides. As long as the root causes of occupation, blockade, and the denial of Palestinian self-determination persist, peace will remain out of reach. Somalia reaffirms its unwavering support for the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, including their right to self-determination and to establish an independent, sovereign state of Palestine with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital, in accordance with relevant UN resolutions and the Arab Peace Initiative. We urge the international community to move beyond statements of concern and toward a principled, coordinated, and an enforceable response that upholds the values and the obligations under the UN Charter. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I'd like to acknowledge Undersecretary General Fletcher and Executive Director Russell's briefings, although I would take issue with some of the characterizations in Mr. Fletcher's remarks, which pointed the finger of blame solely on Israel, with one reference to Hamas. I will also address in my remarks how refusal to work with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is tantamount to dereliction of duty in the humanitarian space. Mr. President, the United States remains actively engaged in addressing the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Special Envoy Witkoff continues to work tirelessly to reach a deal that would free the hostages and bring about a ceasefire that will pave the way for peace and prosperity in Gaza and the broader region. Mr. President, before I continue, I want to state that we are aware of reports of fatalities at a Gaza Humanitarian Foundation site in Khan Yunis, and the United States mourns this loss of life. The GHF stated it confiscated weapons at the site and has credible reason to believe that elements within the crowd, armed and affiliated with Hamas, deliberately fomented the unrest. Regarding our diplomatic efforts, Israel has accepted proposed ceasefire terms. However, Hamas continues to stubbornly reject them. We would have a ceasefire today if Hamas had agreed to the proposal on the table. The responsibility for the situation in Gaza lies solely with Hamas. It is long overdue for members of this Council and the UN system to place the pressure where it belongs, on Hamas, which continues to prolong this war and hold 50 hostages, including Americans Itai Hen and Omer Nutra, in captivity. Hamas has held them captive for more than 21 months. The United States will not rest until all remaining hostages come home. Mr. President, no one wants to see Palestinian civilians in Gaza go hungry and thirsty. The United States supports getting assistance to civilians in Gaza. This should happen in a way that does not allow Hamas to benefit. And with respect to reported fatalities or injuries of humanitarian workers as a result of IDF fire, we wish a swift recovery to those injured and offer condolences to those killed. And we recognize Israel's ongoing commitments to investigate these incidents. I would also recall that on June 11th, we witnessed Hamas's murder of 8 innocent Palestinians who were working on behalf of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation attempting to feed their fellow civilians in Gaza. We condemn Hamas's murders in the strongest possible terms. And with respect to West Bank violence, to which many have referred, I would simply note that Ambassador Huckabee has stated that we have asked Israel to aggressively investigate the murder of Saif Musalat, an American citizen who was visiting family in Sinjar when he was beaten to death. There must be accountability for this criminal and terrorist act, and our condolences are with Saif's family. Mr. President, unfortunately today, we have heard many council members and aid agencies continue to defend a failed system rather than support the GHF as it delivers life-saving assistance to those in need. We would urge member states and the UN to support the GHF and stop echoing incorrect information that benefits Hamas and undermines the secure delivery of aid to civilians in Gaza. It is unconscionable that members of this council have focused on criticizing the GHF rather than condemning Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad for their continued abuse of the Palestinian civilians in Gaza. The result is an ever-growing credibility gap for the United Nations. The Security Council, member states, and the United Nations have failed to condemn Hamas's attacks against GHF personnel. Hamas has murdered innocent Palestinians and injured 2 Americans working for the GHF and attempting to feed civilians. In the previous system, Hamas systematically looted humanitarian assistance, turning aid into a tool of control. We saw during the previous ceasefire how the diversion of aid helped Hamas replenish its ranks. Hamas cynically exploited aid for its own purposes, leaving civilians to navigate chaos and lawlessness. The United States supports the delivery of humanitarian aid to civilians in Gaza in a manner that does not benefit Hamas. The GHF is providing crucial and successful. The GHF is a crucial and successful mechanism for doing so, distributing more than 76 million meals to civilians in Gaza to date. They succeed where the old system failed in preventing Hamas from using aid to stay in power. It has consistently been able to deliver aid to civilians and remains committed to delivering aid consistent with the humanitarian principles of impartiality, neutrality, independence, and humanity. The GHF is a results-focused alternative to a broken aid system, following through on President Trump's commitment to feed Gaza's civilians without supporting Hamas or prolonging the conflict. The United States supports creative solutions that securely provide aid to Palestinians in Gaza without supporting Hamas or other terrorist organizations, and welcomes the additional aid entering Gaza following the agreement between the European Union and Israel. The United States has worked with GHF to assist the foundation in scaling up and increasing its effectiveness. Mr. President, while no mechanism is perfect, this is a good one and it is continuously getting better, and the UN should help it do so. We urge Council members to join us in supporting the work of the GHF as it delivers life-saving aid to civilians on the ground. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States and now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for convening this meeting to receive an update on the humanitarian situation in Gaza. I also thank USG Fletcher and UNICEF Executive Director Russell for the sobering briefings and for their and their team's tireless work in providing a lifeline for Palestinians under the most challenging circumstances. The catastrophic humanitarian conditions being endured by civilians in Gaza, many of them children, continue to deteriorate rapidly. As we heard from the briefers today, the situation has worsened beyond imagination. The civilian population, already several times displaced, is now facing crisis-level food insecurity. It was heartbreaking to hear WFP's Deputy Executive Director speak recently of mothers in Gaza trying to prevent their children from playing so they could conserve energy due to lack of food. Just this week, 7 children waiting for water were among those killed in an Israeli airstrike. As the parties haggle over ceasefire conditions, the world is witnessing a cruel war on children. According to UNICEF, more than 50,000 children have reportedly been killed or injured in Gaza, and nearly every child knows what it is to be displaced, their families torn apart, and their homes destroyed. This devastation is unfolding as tons of life-saving food, medicines, and other basics sit in trucks across the border, waiting months for the green light to enter Gaza. Already stretched relief efforts are being further hindered by the denial of entry of necessary fuel supplies. We note the joint statement issued over the weekend by UN agencies, where it was made clear that fuel is the backbone of survival in Gaza, powering hospitals, water systems, sanitation networks, ambulances, kitchens, and every aspect of humanitarian operations. Also made clear is the fact that without adequate fuel, UN agencies may be forced to cease operations entirely, meaning no health services, no clean water, and no capacity to deliver aid. The small amounts of fuel finally being allowed into Gaza represent a tiny fraction of the hundreds of thousands of liters of fuel needed each day to sustain daily life and critical aid operations. Fuel shortages have already resulted in maternity, neonatal, and intensive care units in hospitals no longer being able to function. Further compounding this desperate situation are the daily reports of civilians being targeted, killed, and injured while seeking aid at militarized aid distribution sites. WFP assesses that nearly 1 in 3 people in the Gaza Strip currently go without eating for days. While we note the planned expansion of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation's distribution program, and hear repeatedly that the goal of the GHF is to facilitate the entry and distribution of humanitarian aid to the civilian population in the Gaza Strip in a manner that prevents its diversion or exploitation by Hamas, we continue to observe the GHF's lack of capacity to achieve its stated objective. With too few sites, those seeking life-saving aids are required to travel long distances under dangerous conditions, and there is repeated chaos as thousands of civilians line up to receive life-saving aid at GHF sites, with many being killed or maimed in the process. OHCHR has reported that as of 13th July, 875 people were killed in Gaza while trying to get food, with 674 of them killed in the vicinity of GHF sites. Today, at least 20 people were killed or reportedly killed in a stampede at the GHF site in Khan Yunis. Urgent action is needed to address deficiencies and to ensure the safety and dignity of those seeking food. In Resolution 2730, adopted in May last year, the Security Council reaffirmed the need for parties to armed conflict to comply with their legal obligations to respect the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution in the conduct of hostilities and refrain from attacking, destroying, removing, or rendering useless objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population. Moreover, the Council's presidential statement of 3rd August 2023, which Guyana co-sponsored, reaffirmed the obligation of all parties to an armed conflict to respect international humanitarian law and to allow and facilitate the rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians in need, in line with the humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, including medical assistance. It also reaffirmed the need for all actors engaged in the provision of such assistance in situations of armed conflict to promote and fully adhere to these principles. This Council must uphold its own decisions and demand compliance from the parties to this conflict. The Council must also insist that increased amounts of food and essential goods, including fuel and medicines, be allowed into Gaza and distributed by the United Nations and other humanitarian operators in keeping with humanitarian principles and international law. The UN has consistently demonstrated its readiness and ability to deliver aid at scale every time there has been an opportunity to get aid into Gaza. Keeping lifelines open in Gaza is an obligation under international law, which requires providing aid and facilitating rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief to civilians in need. We remind that in an occupied territory, the occupying power must ensure that food and medical supplies are provided to the population in a manner that does not put their lives in mortal danger. Mr. President, colleagues, Guyana is also concerned about the continued attacks on schools that have become a sanctuary for displaced persons, resulting in new waves of forced displacement. According to UN estimates, over 725,000 people have been displaced since the breakdown of the ceasefire in March, with the Israeli military continuing to issue new displacement orders every day. In the West Bank, Israeli settlers and military forces have also intensified their attacks against Palestinian civilians, resulting in the killing of civilians and the demolition of their homes. According to OHCHR, some 30,000 Palestinians were forcibly displaced since the launch of Israel's Operation Iron Wall in the north of the occupied West Bank earlier this year. An immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Gaza remains the only viable hope for its suffering population. There must also be an immediate, dignified, and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other groups, as well as the safe and unhindered access to humanitarian aid. Guyana continues to appeal for peace to be given a chance in the Middle East. Peace premised on a resolution of the Palestinian conflict in line with the two-state solution, where the Palestinian people can live in peace, dignity, and in harmony with their neighbors. Mr. President, the Middle East deserves peace. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement and now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, President. At the outset, I would like to thank Mr. Tom Fletcher, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, and the Executive Director of UNICEF, Ms. Catherine Russell. We have heard them, and they are among the rare people committed to honesty, courage, and truth. We convey to you all our support. I would also like to thank you for the two briefings which have conveyed with painful honesty the reality in Gaza, where the only reality is death. How can it be otherwise while the Israeli occupation forces continue to inflict on the Palestinians all forms of death? They have this illusion fed by arrogance and the madness of power that they can empty Palestine from its people, thus paving the way for a new geography where history does not recognize its indigenous people. But for those who want to rewrite history, we say, ending the occupation and enabling the Palestinians to exercise their natural and legal inalienable right to their land is a historical inevitability. And those attempting to stop the wheels of history will be met by the same destiny as their predecessors. The land knows its people. Mr. President, in Gaza, an existential war is being waged, a war that does not need pretexts, because those who have the monopoly of force can make pretexts and export them, and can promote them and find those who will believe it, providing them with immunity and cover. In the Security Council, sessions abound, statements are delivered, but they do not dissuade the occupier and they do not stop the massacre. Our meetings, despite their abundance, reflect the concern of the international community towards what is happening. At the same time, our meetings reveal the inability of the international community to adopt the necessary resolutions and to impose respect of their will when it comes to the Israeli occupier. What is even more surprising, colleagues, is that we are hearing some defending the killers and finding them and themselves justifications. For some, killing children is a mere collateral damage. Maybe because they are Palestinians, they can be killed. Can you believe this? UNRWA estimated that Israel kills daily since the 7th of October 2023 a whole classroom of children, where the number of pupils per classroom is between 35 and 45 children. Children are paying the price. More than 18,000 children have been killed, 17,000 of whom reached hospitals. 10 children in the Gaza Strip are losing daily one or both legs. Whom should we believe? Then we hear some justifying the targeting of hospitals. And we hear them justifying the targeting of hospitals. They say that hospitals are command and control centers, while the WHO and other actors say otherwise. Physicians for Human Rights Israel has affirmed, and I quote, "The Israeli army has deliberately attacked hospitals and medical facilities. These attacks have led to a total collapse of the health system in Gaza, including the deliberate destruction of the infrastructure, an acute lack in medical equipment and essential medicine." End of quotation. Whom should we believe? Some are trying to convince themselves and to convince us that the current aid distribution system is in line with the humanitarian principles and that it is the ideal solution for the security concerns of the occupier. But the distribution points have been turned into death traps, and aid is being militarized to be used to displace, not to save. The ICRC has reaffirmed, I quote, on the 12th of July, the field hospital of the Red Cross in Rafah has received 132 people injured by weapons. This is the most recent incident of mass injury on distribution sites. Tragically, 25 persons were declared dead upon their arrival, while 6 others died after they entered hospital. End of quotation. Whom should we believe? They say that there is no famine in Gaza and that calories are being calculated and needs are being met. But the reality shows otherwise. We see in Gaza people bitten by hunger. We see baby formula becoming a rare commodity. According to UNICEF, and I quote, last month, more than 75% of households have had a decreased access to water, and they do not have enough water to drink and cannot wash their hands when needed. Malnutrition is also on the rise. More than 9,000 children have been hospitalized to receive treatment for acute malnutrition since the beginning of this year. End of quotation. Whom should we believe? Should we believe the pale faces of Gazans and their teary eyes? Or should we believe the language of killing? Should we believe those who are falsifying the truth and asking us to believe it in the name of pragmatism, double standards, and political considerations? The enormity of the atrocities that are being committed requires each one of us to listen to our humanity and to call for investigation and accountability. Before all that, we should call for a ceasefire and save the Palestinians. Mr. President, amidst these repeated massacres, we should not be fooled by names. We should not be distracted by legal arguments. Call it what you may: ethnic cleansing, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, or a military operation. The result is one and the same: bodies dying from thirst before dying with bombs and bullets, and children born without a childhood and dying without graves. Meanwhile, the world remains silent, a silence that belongs to the language of crime, not to the language of conscience. Until when? Until when will we explain tragedy with cold terminology? Until when will we answer the killer with mere expressions of concern? And until when will we describe the victim as a mistake? This silence, under the pretext of diplomacy, amounts to bearing witness to a crime, and history will record it not as an impartiality, but as treason. Therefore, it is not enough to condemn. It is not enough to regret. Enough words. The obligation now is to act. The obligation is to use the tools provided by the UN Charter to end these crimes that are clear to everyone. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
I thank you for convening this urgent meeting of the Security Council at the request of Denmark, France, Greece, Slovenia, and the United Kingdom. I also thank Undersecretary General Tom Fletcher and UNICEF's Executive Director, Catherine Russell, for their sobering and important briefings. I also thank them and the humanitarian workers for their sacrificial work. On the tragic humanitarian situation in Gaza, it is important to reiterate that for Sierra Leone, we speak not as a distant observer, but as a state with deep understanding of the horrors of conflict, impunity, and international indifference. We understand too well what it means when the international humanitarian law is disregarded and when civilians are left defenseless. We speak from that place of experience, empathy, and enduring responsibility, committed to the protection of civilians, the preservation of international law, and the pursuit of peace with justice. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is beyond catastrophic. It is inhumane and indefensible. We know that in the response to indeed the brutal and condemnable attacks of 7th October 2023 and the unlawful taking of hostages by Hamas and other armed groups, acts of terror which we have condemned, the state of Israel's military operations in Gaza have resulted in the death of over 58,000 Palestinians, including over 17,000 children, 10,000 women, and 4,000 elderly persons. No vulnerable or protected group has been spared from the brutality. Over 139,000 people have been injured, most of them women and children, and more than 9,000 remain missing, presumed buried under rubble. These are not abstract statistics. They are lives lost, family devastated, and futures erased. With the restrictions imposed on UN aid distribution and the commencement of food distribution by the euphemized Gaza Humanitarian Foundation in late May 2025, we continue to express grave concern over reports indicating that over 700 Palestinian civilians have been killed near aid distribution points, with over 600 of those fatalities occurring at or around GHF-operated sites. These tragic deaths resulting from stampedes, crush injuries, and the use of live ammunition by Israeli forces and contracted security personnel underscore the urgent need for the protection of humanitarian operations and the civilians they intend to serve. The rising toll is not an unfortunate side effect of conflict, nor collateral damage, but the result of deliberate policies that deprive civilians of their most basic rights. The ongoing siege, collective punishment, targeting of infrastructure, denial of humanitarian access, and the use of starvation as a method of warfare all constitute grave breaches of international humanitarian law. IHL is unambiguous. The Fourth Geneva Convention prohibits collective punishment and places obligations on occupying powers to ensure the provision of food, medical care, and essential services. Additional Protocol 1 of 1977 under Article 54 explicitly prohibits the starvation of civilians as a method of warfare. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, applicable in this case, defines the intentional starvation of civilians by impeding relief supplies as a war crime. The Genocide Convention of 1948 under Article 2C defines deliberately inflicting on a group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part as a constituent element of genocide. These obligations are binding on the parties. The International Court of Justice, in the case of South Africa versus Israel, has issued provisional measures ordering the government of Israel to permit humanitarian assistance. These measures are also binding. They must be respected. But they have been and are being continually disregarded at best. This Council has a responsibility to ensure compliance. International jurisprudence, including from the ICTY, has affirmed that the denial of food, water, shelter, and medical care, especially when accompanied by widespread destruction and forced displacement, can constitute evidence of genocidal acts. The Appeals Chamber, dealing with the Srebrenica genocide, cited such conditions in determining genocidal intent. It bears repeating that the obligation to prevent genocide is a preemptory norm of international law and is erga omnes, owed by all states to the international community as a whole. This duty requires not only abstention from acts of genocide, but also proactive measures to prevent such crimes where there is a serious risk of their occurrence. Accordingly, a blanket refutation, consistent denial, and not a sufficient response to an erroneous obligation. The pattern of mass civilian killings, obstruction of humanitarian aid, and the systemic targeting of life-sustaining infrastructure in Gaza must be examined within this prism. Indeed, today in Gaza, we see indicators of prolonged bombardment, the destruction of crops and wells, targeted killings of journalists and humanitarian workers, the cutting of fuel, water, and electricity supplies, and public calls by senior officials of the government of Israel for the displacement of the population. These acts, taken cumulatively, raise serious concerns about both international humanitarian law and international criminal law. Inaction, therefore, in the face of such grave breaches, undermine the collective commitment of states under the Genocide Convention and the UN Charter, and risk eroding the foundational principles of our shared humanity. Mr. President, Sierra Leone urges its Council to act decisively and without delay. We call on the members of this Council with the means to do so to act. The rules-based international order must not be sacrificed to inertia or geopolitics. We therefore call for, first, a complete cessation of hostilities and the initiation of a credible, irreversible political process leading to a permanent ceasefire. Second, the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, including Israeli civilians held by Hamas and Palestinian detainees held without due process. Third, an immediate and unconditional lifting of the aid restrictions and restoration of full and unhindered humanitarian access. We therefore welcome the announcement of the agreement between the State of Israel and the European Union last week to expand the entry of humanitarian aid into the Gaza Strip through multiple crossings, allow for the repair of critical infrastructure, and ensure the protection of aid workers. Fourth, full compliance with the International Court of Justice provisional measures, including those mandating the facilitation of humanitarian assistance. Equally important is the implementation of all relevant resolutions of the Security Council, including 2712, 2720, and 2735. These resolutions are still valid and binding on the parties. Fifth, independent, impartial, and transparent investigations into all alleged violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law, including a call for an immediate investigation into the fatalities at GHF aid distribution sites and convoys. Sierra Leone commends the ongoing diplomatic efforts, including those led by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States, to achieve a ceasefire and scale up aid delivery. We also welcome the joint reconvening by France and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia of the postponed international conference on the establishment of the Palestinian statehood and a two-state solution. We affirm our support for the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and for a two-state solution. In closing, Mr. President, we must note that this Council, in just 2 generations, must not be remembered for what it again failed to prevent. We must endeavor to discharge our responsibility until relief reaches Gaza, the hostages are released, and hostility ceases. In the face of current inaction, we must also not be silent. As we recall the solemn words of never again, it must apply universally to all peoples, in all places, and at all times, in particular to the people of Palestine, in the occupied Palestinian territory, and now. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Pakistan. I would like to join colleagues in thanking Under Secretary General Fletcher and Executive Director Russell for the compelling briefings. We appreciate and support your work. Certainly, to properly describe the situation was beyond vocabulary. For the situation was actually beyond belief, unimaginable in this time and age. We support your calls primarily for standing unequivocally with international law and international humanitarian law and for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Colleagues, Gaza teeters on the brink of total devastation, a man-made catastrophe where death stems not only from bombardments, but from the systematic dismantling of the conditions necessary for life. Over 58,000 people have been killed, more than 138,000 wounded, and the entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Hospitals are barely functioning as supply chains collapse. Starvation is being used as a tool of war, and aid, the last lifeline for millions, has itself become a perilous pursuit. Just this past week, on 12th of July, dozens of civilians were reportedly killed when Israeli forces opened fire near an aid distribution queue in the Gaza city. Men, women, and children were waiting in the blistering heat for food. Instead, they found death. This is not an isolated incident. It is part of a pattern that underscores the urgent need for change. On another sweltering July morning, 7-month-old Salam lay motionless in her mother's trembling arms, her tiny ribs protruding like fragile twigs beneath skin drawn thin by hunger, her sunken eyes too weak to cry, flickered faintly as UNRWA health workers rushed to assist her at a bomb-damaged clinic. For weeks, her family had wandered the rubble-strewn streets for infant formula, but without success. Aid distribution points had none. UN-run centers were either inaccessible, out of supplies, or under threat. As doctors worked frantically to stabilize her, Salam's breathing grew shallower, her faint whimpers fading into silence. By nightfall, she was gone. One of 67 children lost to starvation in the past month, while thousands of aid trucks remained stuck at Gaza's borders, obstructed by bureaucratic delays and militarized checkpoints. Salam's death was not an isolated tragedy. It was the unfortunate yet foreseeable result of a system that has allowed hunger to become a weapon of war, a reality so grotesque that experienced medics are now grappling with the levels of malnutrition they once only saw in textbooks. Colleagues, I wish to highlight 5 urgent points here. First, the current aid mechanism is clearly failing those it claims to serve. According to the UN Human Rights Office, 798 aid-related killings have occurred since late May. 615 of them at or near distribution sites. The UN-coordinated system of more than 400 well-networked distribution points has been dismantled. In its place, a heavily restricted system under the GHF now operates with just a handful of designated aid sites. This forces desperate civilians to traverse active combat zones in search of basic necessities. While some aid has trickled into Gaza, the volume is vastly inadequate. Its implementation is flawed, and it falls far short of the standards demanded by international humanitarian law. Most gravely, the system has morphed into a death trap. Second, the denial of life-saving assistance, particularly infant formula, has reached indefensible levels. Newborns face imminent risk of death by starvation. This form of deprivation cannot be justified under any circumstances. Immediate, unimpeded access must be granted for delivery of essential supplies. Third, Gaza is in the grip of a worsening shortage of medical supplies, shelter, and fuel. On 12th July, UN agencies issued a stark warning. Fuel reserves had reached critical lows, threatening to shut down hospitals, water and sanitation systems, telecommunications, bakeries, ambulances, and humanitarian operations. For a population of 2.1 million, this is a catastrophic tipping point. Fuel, medical aid, and shelter materials must be allowed without delay. Fourth, the current aid mechanism sets a dangerous precedent. Replacing neutral UN-led humanitarian operations with a militarized, selectively coordinated structure undermines the neutrality and impartiality that are cornerstones of humanitarian law. The consequences will reverberate beyond Gaza, endangering civilian protection in future conflicts. Fifth, and most critically, this catastrophe is not inevitable. It is the result of deliberate choices, policies, and actions of Israel, the occupying power. It can and must be reversed. The international community must act without delay. The objectives are clear and widely shared: an immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire. And we appreciate the efforts that are underway to achieve that. The lifting of the blockade and restoration of full, unhindered, and impartial humanitarian access in accordance with international humanitarian law through the UN system, including UNRWA, the release of hostages and Palestinian prisoners, the unambiguous rejection of all illegal policies and actions of the occupying power, including settlement activity, any forcible displacement of Palestinians from their lands, and finally, and most fundamentally, addressing the root cause of this crisis, the prolonged Israeli occupation and the denial of Palestinian rights. A just and lasting peace in the Middle East requires realization of the two-state solution with an independent, sovereign, and contiguous Palestinian state based on pre-1967 borders with Al-Quds, Al-Sharif as its capital. In this regard, we look forward to the high-level conference later this month to be co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia, and hope that it will yield concrete outcomes. Colleagues, the world cannot stand by as Gaza is starved and shattered. Let us not grow numb to the daily toll of lives. It is not just another headline, another ticker on our screens, another statistic. Behind each number is a life, a person with a story, a dream extinguished, a family torn apart. History will judge us anyways, but let us be judged by our actions on the side of humanity and international law, and not by silence and passivity. I thank you. I resume my functions as President of the Council. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. A couple members made very serious allegations of genocide. Mr. President, these accusations are categorically false and they fuel anti-Semitism around the world. America fully supports Israel's right to defend itself. Israel has taken numerous measures to limit harm to civilians and to address humanitarian needs. The loss of life in Gaza is tragic, but responsibility for this rests with Hamas, which could stop the fighting today by freeing the hostages and agreeing to a ceasefire on the terms already accepted by Israel. I thank you.
The representative of the United States for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the observer state of Palestine.
Thank you, Mr. President. More than 2 million Palestinians, half of them children, and for more than 650 days now, wake up without knowing if they will make it through the day, and go to sleep without knowing if they will wake up in the morning. Day after day after day. They spent every hour, all 15,600 hours of them, with death besieging them. For an entire generation of Palestinians, death is now much more familiar than life. 2 million people have to snatch everything out of the claws of death: food, water, shelter, time. They are being killed in the places where they are supposed to find life, killed in tents, killed while seeking food or water, killed in hospitals. Every single day has its share of tragedies. We speak of these today. 15 civilians killed, including 9 children, while waiting to receive treatment for malnutrition. 11 killed, including seven children, while queuing for water. Because of occupation-made water scarcity and occupation-made food scarcity. And every day, 40, 50, 60 Palestinians killed while seeking food. We fear the world is growing accustomed to the unbearable, to the unacceptable. Imagine what it is to be a parent in Gaza. You know that any disease and any wound can be fatal for your child. You know that the family you leave to get food or water or help could be gone by the time you return. Do you take them to the hospital with the fear that they might be killed there, or keep them with you while they might die within your arms? Do you go get food and risk getting shot, or send a family member and risk losing them, or stay and risk seeing your children starve to death? Do you go get water, send a member of your family go get water at the peril of your life or their lives, or risk seeing your family die of thirst? Do you evacuate one more time, forcibly displaced again and again, and get killed on the way, or stay put and get killed where you are? Every decision they are making while we speak is a life and death decision. Every single day, every single hour, every single minute. But it is a Russian roulette with a bullet in almost every chamber. Whatever decision you make, most probably somebody is going to die. Every single family in Gaza is moving between one death and another as the whole world watches on. For 1 million minutes now. In Gaza, all paths lead to death, and our role, our responsibility, our legal and moral duty is to open one that leads to salvation. One that leads to salvation. Israel wants that path to be leaving Gaza. That was the whole plan from day one. In the words of Mahmoud Darwish, this siege will endure until we are truly persuaded into choosing a harmless slavery, but in total freedom. They want to say, we chose to leave. We chose to be occupied. We chose to be oppressed. It is our fault.
It's always our fault. That has been the narrative since the beginning. Didn't they say we were responsible for our own Nakba, that we left on our own, forgetting the massacres and the towns and villages destroyed? Let them leave, they say. This is Israel's solution for the Palestine question, a right to further and definitive exile, rather than a right of return or a right to life and liberty in our ancestral homeland. Mr. President, humanitarian assistance, like international law, are expressions of our recognition of the value of human life, all human life, and of the inherent dignity of each and every person. States have rights, peoples have rights, human beings have rights. But Israel does not recognize our state. It does not recognize our people. It does not recognize us as equal human beings endowed with rights. They find it outrageous that anybody can dare be outraged by the fate they have reserved to our people. Mr. President, distribution of aid is distribution of life. It is about safeguarding life. We measure our success by impact, by the lives we save. We keep discussing trucks and how many meals were distributed, and we count calories while infants are dying of malnutrition, while civilians seek food, water, shelter at the peril of their lives, while the infrastructure of life is being dismantled altogether. Aid must be delivered at scale. Aid must be delivered to all. Aid must be delivered across all of Gaza. This is non-negotiable. This shouldn't be a point of contention or debate or discussion. Israel has obligations as an occupying power to do so. We support an immediate ceasefire and the mediation efforts of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States to secure such a ceasefire. But that is not a reason, nor an excuse, nor a pretext, in the meantime, to continue killing Palestinians or to continue denying them the aid they are entitled to. Every day, a death sentence is executed against somewhere between 90 and 130 Palestinians. Their crime, the real crime they are being executed for, is being Palestinian. How is that possible? You heard Israeli leaders say there are no innocent civilians in Gaza, speak of human animals, and they are treating our people as such. What if we had said these words? There are no innocents in Israel. They support the occupation, they support the genocide, they voted for the people killing us or occupying us or subjugating us. They cheered while we were killed. That is not acceptable as a reasoning. No civilian can be killed based on what a group or a government is doing. No civilian can be held responsible for that and be killed for that. All civilians are entitled to protection, regardless of nationality, faith, or race, to be protected from being killed, from being taken hostage or arbitrarily detained, from being subjected to inhumane and degrading treatment, to torture, to forcible displacement. These are basics. These are the foundations of our international law-based order, and we still need to speak again of them because they are not being upheld. This continuous incitement and dehumanization kills and makes the most horrific plans become mainstream in Israel, including the crazy and criminal idea to ethnically cleanse the Gaza Strip. Every day, it's been 650 days, every day, 77 children are killed or maimed in Gaza. Every day, 61 children in Gaza lose a parent. Every day, 10 children lose one or both legs. Every single day. The biggest cohort of children killed and maimed, the biggest cohort of child amputees, the biggest cohort of orphans. How is that possible? Netanyahu summed it up. This is a struggle, he said, between the children of light and the children of darkness, end quote. Why should one care about the children of darkness? All children are God's creation. All children are God's children. Here they are, those Palestinian children whose light shines over the entire earth. and who were subjected to darkness. Hind, who was stuck with her family in a car, and after all the adults had been killed, her cousin Leone, 15 years old, was begging the rescuers to come and save them until she was struck by multiple bullets by Israeli occupation forces. That's when the world discovered the voice of Hind, begging to be rescued. Finally, she was also killed, and the rescuers coming to help her were killed. Khalid and Reem, we did not discover them like this. They were inseparable. We discovered them only when Reem was killed. And as her grandfather was holding his 3-year-old granddaughter, kissing her as if she was still alive, calling upon her, the soul of his soul, to stay with him. A few months later, Khalid also was killed. Yusuf, the 7-year-old, the youngest of his family, the boy with the curly hair, as he will become to be known for all Palestinians and for people around the world, also killed. The family of the pediatrician, Ala Najjar, who lost 9 of her 10 children. Only Adam survived. 9 of her 10 children. Sidar, Luqman, Sadin, Rival, Ruslan, Jubran, Eve, Rakan, and Yahya, aged between 7 months and 12 years. The Arafat family, the entire family found itself under the rubble. 13 members of the family were killed, including 7 children, in an airstrike, and the Israeli forces prevented rescuers from saving them. The images of Hala, 35 years old, as she was calling to be saved from under the rubble, will remain as part of the memory, collective memory of our people. And Salam, that you evoked, Mr. President, 6 months old when she was screened for malnutrition, only to die a few days later. One image among many of our children starving. I will spare you the images of our children burning. Dunya, who lost a leg in an Israeli airstrike, where she lost also her family members, her mother, her father, her brother, and sister. And Dunya, resilient, said, I will not lose hope. I will not give up on my dreams. I will become a doctor to help people. She was killed when a tank shell struck a children's ward at Al-Nasr Hospital a few weeks later. Hur lost her leg lost her family, her father, her mother, her 3 brothers. Doctors had to amputate her left hand entirely and the fingers of her right hand, and she had wounds at her head and legs. Siwar and Selina, 3 years and 21 months old, together in life and together in death. This image, unfortunately tragic images, are the ones winning this World Photo Prize by Samar Abu al-Auf, a photo of Mahmoud, 9-year-old Palestinian boy whose arms were severed and mutilated during an Israeli attack on Gaza. But also in the West Bank, 8-year-old Adam, he ran when Israeli occupation forces shot at him, his brother, and his cousin. His cousin was killed. And he was killed when he was struck by a bullet while he was running away, a bullet in his head, in the back of his head. Remember these faces. It is our duty to remind you of them, not to allow you to forget them. And remember all the children we can still save. In the West Bank, Israel displaced 40,000 people and destroyed entire refugee camps in Tulkarem, Tubas, and Jenin. It killed almost 1,000 Palestinians in the last 20 months. including 200 children. Palestinian villages are under incessant attacks by settlers and occupation forces from Masafir Yatta to Kafar Malik, from Taibe to Deir Debwan to Sinjil, where Saif Muslat was beaten to death by the settlers, and Muhammad al-Shalabi was shot in the chest and died. And again there in the West Bank, rescuers too were denied to reach the victim for several hours until they could no longer be saved. The same patterns at a different scale. Rampage and burning, destroying, killing Palestinian families and homes and hospitals and schools and mosques and churches and cemeteries and infrastructure and businesses. Everything is under attack. Palestinian presence and life in the land of Palestine is under attack. What world is this where Israel can claim it can kill anyone in Gaza? They are either terrorists who deserve to be killed, or human shield, it cannot be blamed for killing them. What if we accept this reasoning that a state cannot be held responsible for the people it kills? Is that the precedent? Is that the world we want to be living in? It is a genocide. Many observers say it, many independent organizations say it, many scholars say it from Israel and the rest of the world. And we blame Israel for these actions, not Israeli civilians, not Jews around the world. They're not responsible for what Israel is doing. And many Jews around the world stand for justice in Palestine and elsewhere. They call it a genocide, and they fight to stop this genocide, and they fight for a future of peace. People in Israel also are able to say it, and we are able to say it around this table. And we stand with everyone, regardless of their nationality and faith, who stand for justice. We stand side by side, shoulder to shoulder. What world is this where one party can destroy a country and all the requirements of life and then pretend to be human and give lessons about the right to voluntary migration? Let them leave, this place is hell, says the person who turned it into hell in the first place. What world is this where a country can use starvation and thirst as weapons of war, and then under pressure to stop, is able to turn aid distribution into a tool to advance death and displacement at the same time? What world is this where putting an end to massacres or to get aid to be distributed is subject to negotiations? What world is this where humanitarian is characterized to identify a so-called city that is inhumane in its design and its purpose? Terms are being distorted, and rules are not only being breached, they are being obliterated. And it is our people who pay the price. What world is this where those defending international law are considered guilty and the perpetrators can never be held to account? Where Israel can be prosecutor, judge, and executioner, and then we will ask them to investigate their own crimes, the ones they were ordered to commit at the highest level of their leadership, espousing these crimes, pushing for these crimes, inciting these crimes, organizing and planning these crimes. What world is this where humanitarians trying to save lives are attacked and killed? Health workers and humanitarians and UN personnel, and those killing them blame them for their death. What world is this where those documenting the crimes perish to silence them? What world is this where we need to say that aid is not a bargaining chip, not a method of pressure, not a weapon of war, not an instrument for displacement and forcible displacement? Mr. President, and I conclude, our role is not to be the narrators of this genocide, but to be part of the movement that brings it to an end. Our role is not to be witnesses and testify. It is to deliver justice and peace. The fate of a nation depends on the decisions that states are willing to take today to save civilians, to end the genocide, to achieve a ceasefire, to release hostages and prisoners, to deliver aid, to ensure the withdrawal of Israeli forces, to deliver justice, to end occupation, to achieve shared peace and security for all, share peace and security, to save humanity and our international law-based order. This world is doomed and damned if it continues allowing for Palestinians to be killed in this manner, to allow children to be killed in this manner. Save Gaza so we may all be saved by Gaza. That will continue to be our call to all to act, states, individuals, entities, organizations, agencies. Save Gaza, or we are all doomed. Save Gaza so we can all be saved by Gaza. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Observer State of Palestine for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before I begin my statement, I would like to comment on the two briefings we heard today. Israel is engaged with various UN agencies in good faith at the highest levels, and it is unfortunate that OCHA has continued to abandon all semblance of neutrality and impartiality in its statements and actions, despite claiming otherwise and claiming to adhere to them here today in this room. While referencing the West Bank and events that took place all the way back in May, both briefers only addressed Palestinian casualties based on information that is presented by Hamas. If it is neutrality and impartiality that our UN colleagues adhere to, why was there no mention, let alone a condemnation, of the terror attack where a 9-month pregnant woman was murdered by Palestinian terrorists and her unborn son was seconded to his wounds 15 days afterwards? Mr. President, Roni and Alma Miran are 4 and 2.5 years old. Like many kids their age, they regularly make pretend phone calls on their toy phones. But unlike most children their age, when their mother, Lishai, asks them who they're speaking to, their answer carries a deep pain. The answer is always the same: Abba, Dad. They ask, "Where are you, Daddy? Are they letting you return to us?" They hug and kiss his photo, not able to physically do so for 21 months. Their father, Omri Miran, has been held hostage by Hamas in Gaza for 649 days. For those two young girls, that's nearly their entire lives without their Abba. Earlier this month, twin sisters Emma and Yuli Cunio, who were themselves abducted by Hamas alongside with their parents on October 7th, celebrated their 5th birthday. What should have been a day filled with balloons, laughter, and joy was instead a somber affair marked by absence and pain, because it was their 2nd birthday without their father, David Cunio, who is still held hostage in Gaza. Their birthday wish was heartbreakingly simple: we just want Dad to come back home. These are not isolated tragedies. These are not statistics. These are shattered families suffering each day in suspended agony. These are innocent civilians held by terrorists, a horror the world must never normalize, a horror that Israel will not accept. Mr. President, we meet today again to discuss the humanitarian situation in Gaza, with a briefing from UNICEF concerning the situation of Palestinian children. Yes, the suffering of Palestinian children and the suffering of children anywhere demands our attention. Yet the glaring silence of this Council about Israeli children, about hostages, murdered toddlers like the Bibas boys, on traumatized survivors who will never see their parents again, on children running for shelter as Iranian missiles rain down on civilian population centers, is more than a technical omission. It is a moral failure. Scores of Israeli children were mutilated, tortured, and murdered on October 7th. Innocent lives cut short by the barbarity of Hamas terrorists. These children were victims of an evil that this Council seems unwilling to address or condemn: Hamas. Instead, we're presented with a narrative that forces Israel into a defendant's chair, while Hamas, the very cause of this conflict and the very instigator of suffering of Israelis, but also of Palestinians, goes unmentioned, unchallenged, and immune to condemnation. Some in this Council seem to forget what caused the humanitarian situation in Gaza. To address the situation without mentioning Hamas's war crimes, hiding weapons in schools, firing rockets from hospitals, using civilians as human shields, is not a humanitarian concern. It is propaganda. And even this additional session held today, a week before an already scheduled dedicated council session, plays directly into the hands of the terrorists who engineered this conflict. It does not support peace, but politicizes suffering. Rather than requesting concrete consultations to learn about the efforts on the ground, the Council gathers to do the opposite, to pressure one side while absolving the other. There is a serious effort on the ground to achieve a hostage deal. Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to Washington last week to meet with President Trump and other senior administration officials underscored just how committed Israel is in its will to achieve a hostage deal. And Israel continues to closely work with the United States and with Egypt and Qatar on reaching a deal that would bring our loved ones home and would end Hamas's reign of terror. Israel will keep supporting the entry of food, baby formula, medicine, and critical supplies because we believe innocent civilians deserve relief from the agony that Hamas has caused them. But we will not allow that aid to become fuel for terror. And yet, even as aid flows in, Hamas does everything in its power to disrupt it. They loot supplies, they obstruct distribution, they intimidate international aid workers, they fire at aid convoys, steal fuel intended for hospitals, and hoard food for their terrorists. They turn the sufferings of the civilians of Gaza into a tool of leverage, and then blame Israel for the very hardship they manufacture. Anyone who truly cares about humanitarian assistance must be serious about condemning those who prevent it from reaching the people. Let us stop pretending that Hamas is a bystander to this crisis. They are its architect. So I ask, does this Council stand with the effort to improve the situation on the ground, or with those who obstruct it? While this Council speaks of humanitarian suffering, let us provide an update on the real humanitarian action underway. Over the past 2 weeks, Israel, together with international organizations, has facilitated the entry of thousands of tons of humanitarian aid into Gaza, using mechanisms designed specifically to bypass Hamas terrorists and reach the civilian population directly. These efforts have been coordinated with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which has now delivered more than 66 million meals to Gazans. In addition, more than 7,500 tons of flour have been delivered to bakeries across Gaza, ensuring bread for families. Today alone, over 130 patients and caregivers, including children, exited Gaza through the Kerem Shalom and Allenby bridge crossings for treatments abroad. So perhaps it's time to put an end to the dissemination of disinformation by some in the Council regarding which paths lead to what. There are paths of cooperation and improvement. Earlier this week, on July 13th, nearly 100 tons of baby formula donated by UNICEF entered Gaza through the Kerem Shalom crossing, facilitated by Israel. We do wonder why this was omitted from the briefing this afternoon. It should be absolutely clear. The aid is for the civilians in Gaza, not for Hamas, and we will continue to facilitate it. Mr. President, Council members, one cannot claim to care about the children and people of Gaza while ignoring the suffering of Israeli children and hostages still held there. A mere mention, a single reference in a 15-minute presentation is not enough. The empty words will not do. You cannot champion peace while turning a blind eye to those who wage terror. If this chamber truly wishes to ease the suffering of all children, Israeli and Palestinians, then you must confront the root of this conflict, and that root is Hamas. Hamas has built its war machine at the expense of Palestinian lives and futures. It has robbed Gazan children of their innocence, indoctrinating them with hate in their classrooms, using them as human shields, and bearing weapons in their schools and hospitals. Imagine what Gaza could be without Hamas, a place of peace, where children learn math, not martyrdom, where aid builds homes, not terror tunnels, where coexistence replaces hate. There are those who wish to work with Israel in good faith, regional partners who cooperate with us to bring hope to children across the region. It can be achieved, but it can only be achieved without Hamas. And it is time for this Council to speak and act with moral clarity to achieve this goal, with demanding the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, deceased and alive, still held in Gaza, by condemning Hamas unequivocally for what it has done to Israelis, but also for what it has caused to the Palestinians by designating Hamas as a terror organization it is. This is what the Council should be focusing on. Israel, on its part, will continue to work with the US, Egypt, and Qatar to reach a hostage deal and to bring all our loved ones home. Mr. President, to conclude, every child deserves safety. Every child deserves a future. That future cannot be built on hate. Our children, all children, deserve more than this Council's silence in the face of terror. They deserve your voice, and they deserve your action. And Alma, Roni, Emma, and Yuli deserve to hug their fathers again. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Israel for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Hakan Fidan, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Turkey.
Thank you, Mr. President. As we gather in this hall today, the genocidal war of Israel against Palestinian people continues unabated. Over 2 million people are enduring unspeakable suffering in the Gaza Strip. Mass displacement and widespread destruction continue. Deliberate obstruction of humanitarian aid is a daily occurrence. Civilians are being indiscriminately killed at aid distribution points as they try to access food and water. Starvation is used as a weapon of war. There is no single principle of international humanitarian law that is not violated by Israel. No need to mince our words. Let us face the stark reality as it is. 80 years later, the world has been once again witnessing concentration camps. A campaign of extermination is ongoing against a whole population. It doesn't make any difference whether you are a child trying to fetch water for your family or a mother seeking food for your children. You are the target of the Israeli war machine. This is a machine fed by hate, and this is a machine fed by impunity. This is only possible because some of us choose to look away even in the face of extreme suffering. This cannot continue. Mr. President, there has been no safe access to humanitarian aid in Gaza for more than 4 months now. The only effective means of delivering aid is through the United Nations. Alternative models compromise the impartiality and dignity of aid delivery. Aid must be delivered promptly, adequately, and without obstruction through all available crossings in full accordance with international humanitarian law and in coordination with the United Nations. The core humanitarian principle of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence must be upheld. Mr. President, to achieve exactly that, from the outset, we have called upon the international community to take urgent action to prevent the spread of war. Israel is trying to implement a strategy of aggression, not only in Palestine, but also in Lebanon, Syria, and Iran. There is a clear pattern here. If left unchecked, this pattern risks wider destabilization. This is exactly what's going on in Syria. Israeli aggression is threatening the fragile peace that Syrian people paid a high price to reach. These attacks are deepening the ethnic fault lines across the region. It should be clear to all of us by now, Israel doesn't want peace, Israel doesn't want stability. We should collectively make sure that Syria doesn't fall into a spiral of violence. The stakes are very high. The ensuing instability will affect the whole region and beyond. Mr. President, the recognition of the legitimate rights of Palestinian people and the establishment of an independent state of Palestine remain essential for lasting peace in the Middle East. That is why we will continue to work towards increasing the international recognition of the State of Palestine and securing full Palestinian membership to the United Nations. Mr. President, one fact is clear beyond any doubt. The UN Security Council not only failed the people of Gaza, it failed human dignity. It failed the very values and principles that the United Nations is founded upon. The crisis in Gaza has passed the point of being a humanitarian emergency. This is now a profound test of our collective humanity. We either pass this test together or fail as a whole. What needs to be done is crystal clear. Stop the Israeli war machine, stop impunity, immediate and sustained ceasefire now, unhindered humanitarian aid now, a renewed and urgent commitment to the two-state solution now. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Fidan for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the UN.
Thank you, Mr. President. The European Union deplores the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, the unacceptable number of civilian casualties, and the levels of starvation. The EU recalls the imperative of ensuring the protection of all civilians, including humanitarian workers, at all times, as well as of civilian infrastructure, including medical facilities and schools, as well as UN premises. Mr. President, the European Union calls on Israel to fully lift its blockade on Gaza, to allow immediate, unimpeded, safe and predictable access and sustained distribution of humanitarian assistance at scale into and throughout Gaza, and to enable the UN and its agencies and humanitarian organizations to work independently and impartially to save lives and reduce suffering. The EU has consistently called on Israel to fully comply with its obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. After a meeting of the EU Council of Ministers in June, the EU High Representative, Kaja Kallas, entered into a dialogue with Israeli authorities on the humanitarian situation. Following that dialogue between the EU and Israel, steps have been agreed by Israel to improve the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. These expected steps include, among other things, the substantial increase of daily trucks for food and non-food items to enter Gaza, the opening of several other crossing points in both the northern and southern areas, the reopening of the Jordanian and Egyptian aid routes, enabling the distribution of food supplies through bakeries and public kitchens throughout the Gaza Strip, the resumption of fuel deliveries for use by humanitarian facilities up to an operational level, the protection of aid workers, the repair and facilitation of works on vital infrastructure, like the resumption of the power supply to the water desalination facility. We can already see some improvements, including delivery of fuel, reopening of the Jordanian and Egyptian routes, opening of a crossing point in North Gaza, and ongoing reparations of essential humanitarian infrastructure, but a lot more is needed. These measures are to be implemented with a common understanding that aid at scale must be delivered in accordance with humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, and that measures will continue to be taken to ensure that there is no aid diversion to Hamas or elsewhere. The EU will closely monitor implementation of these steps. We welcome updates from our humanitarian partners in this regard. At the same time, the European Union continues to call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and the unconditional release of all hostages, leading to a permanent end to hostilities. The EU continues to fully support the mediators, United States, Egypt, and Qatar. The EU deplores the refusal of Hamas to hand over the remaining hostages. I reaffirm the EU's commitment to a lasting and sustainable peace based on the two-state solution, with the State of Israel and an independent, democratic, contiguous, sovereign, and viable State of Palestine living side by side in peace and security and mutual recognition. We are ready to contribute to all efforts towards this solution and call on all parties to refrain from actions that undermine its viability. In this context, the EU will continue supporting the Palestinian Authority and its reform agenda. President, in this context as well, we look forward to the high-level international conference for the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine and the implementation of a two-state solution, co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia from 28 to 30 of July. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Lambrinidis for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.
Hey, Tom, that's it.